You should now have a basic understanding of permissions in .cms. However, let's discuss a few more topics that will help you gain a deeper grasp and are very important to understand when configuring permissions. Firstly, let's talk about hereditary permissions. When looking at our roles on the left-hand side, these 4 roles, intranet, publisher legal, system, and training, are roles. However, within each one of these, we can have additional roles. For instance, within our system role, we have administrator, campaign manager admin, etc. Within those, we could even have further roles. When you have roles that are children of other roles, you have a hierarchy of roles. And that hierarchy is important to understand. When creating a role within another, or creating a child role, the parent role will automatically inherit the permissions of the child role. For instance, here we have our training role. You'll notice that we have access to view our ProServe training site, but we can't add children to that site. Well, let's create a new role within our training role. I'll click the plus sign, add a role, and we'll call this our training admin. We'll grant users permissions and tools and click Save. We'll expand training and select training admin. You'll notice training admin does not have any permissions yet, so we know that the child does not inherit permissions naturally from the parent. This is good because we might want someone with permissions at a higher level above those with permissions at a lower level. And if we do, we probably don't want those lower level folks to have the permissions of a higher level role. Let's go ahead and apply permissions similar to those in our training role. I'll add the site or folder, ProServe-training, and click Add. And now we'll check all the same boxes. Now, I'll apply these changes first, and once again, we'll compare. Looking at our training role, we can see that we cannot add children to the ProServe training site, nor can we edit the training folder. So, let's go to our training admin role and check the box for adding children on our ProServe training site. And now let's also add the changes for the folder within it. Let's expand ProServe training and select training. We'll click Add, and now again, we'll make all the same changes. But in this case, we'll also allow the training admin to edit the training folder. We'll check the edit box and click Apply Changes. Now, as we stated before, permissions changes can take some time to populate, so we may not see those changes immediately apply. Another thing to discuss is cascade changes. We talked about this briefly in the last video. However, it's important to note there are times where you may need to cascade your changes. Firstly, I would strongly recommend attempting to make the change first without cascading changes. If that doesn't work as expected, then you may want to consider cascading those changes. If you do cascade those changes, keep in mind that it will wipe out any individual permissions that exist on all children below this role. So be very careful about cascading changes. There are some cases in which cascading changes is necessary. For instance, if you're changing permissions on a content type, the changes will only apply to any new content created. Any existing content will maintain its existing permissions. If you're changing permissions on anything else, the new permissions will be picked up by any content or objects which are set to inherit permissions, but not until after the changes are complete in the background, as we discussed prior. Now, when speaking on inheritance of roles, the parent will automatically inherit permissions from the child role. However, objects are the opposite. If we go to our site browser and we take a look at our training images folder, our images folder will automatically inherit permissions from our training folder. So it's important to keep this in mind in the direction of that inheritance, that it is opposite for objects as it is for roles. Now let's talk about another critical concept to understand with permissions, the site or folder field. Taking a look at our content, let's go to our content model and content types. Let's take a quick look at destination. We notice here that it has a site or folder field. Creating any destination content type will require us to populate a site or folder field. This essentially tells .cms where that new content should live. However, if the content type does not have a site or folder field, then the content of that content type will by default inherit permissions from the content type itself. If the content type has not had permissions set, then it's going to, by default, inherit permissions from the site that the content type is located on. It's important to note this because if you haven't set permissions for that content type, but create a new piece of content that you only want certain roles to be able to access or edit, then that may not be the case, and everyone might be able to view or access that content. So ensure that you're applying permissions to content types without a site or folder field, or at the very least, ensure that you're aware of exactly how this will be handled and that you're okay with that new piece of content inheriting the permissions from the site. However, if that content type does have a site or folder field, then it will inherit the permissions from whatever site or folder that content is saved into. This means there are two ways to control permissions on content. You can either 1. Create separate content types without site or folder fields, or 2. Create a single content type which has a site or folder field. Once you have the content type with a site or folder field, then set the different roles to have permissions to create and edit content only in those locations. This allows that same content type to be reused across sites and folders, but still limit the rights that different users have over that content created by users with different roles. This is a very critical concept that a lot of people don't necessarily grasp when getting into permissions, so it's helpful and important to keep it in mind.